this short lesson, we're going to teach you about the building blocks that make up an application in Oracle Visual Builder Cloud Service. In this diagram, you actually see the various building blocks that we're going to talk about and the relationships between them. We're going to talk about business objects, REST interfaces, variables and UI components, as well as actions. So the basic concepts are: business objects that you create in VBCS are exposed as REST services. You can also use external REST services in VBCS. In order to show UIs in VBCS, you create pages using UI components. The UI components presents values that in a lot of cases come from those REST services. In order to store those values, you use variables. So variables get the data from a REST service, and then the UI component is bounded to a variable and present that value. UI components can raise events, and those events are handled by actions. Actions have access to the variables and can then invoke REST services and pass variables to them, or get values from REST services and put them into variables. So those are the basic components. Now let's see an explanation of this by looking at actual development. So we're going to quickly teach you some concepts about VBCS. We're going to create a small Crash 1 application. That's part of our Crash course. And in this application, we're just going to use our data manager to bring in information from an Excel spreadsheet. This Excel spreadsheet would do just fine. This would create two business objects for us. And we're going to use those to demonstrate the basic declarative approach of development, and then show you what is actually happening behind the scene. Okay. First of all, when you create the business object, of course, each one of them has a set of APIs, okay, to get the data. Those are just REST services that return the data. You can see the endpoints of those over here. When you go and you create a web application, and you drop, for example, a table on the page, you would hook up this to the business service by accessing the REST methods that they expose. Okay, and then selecting, for example, which fields you want to show on the page. Alright, so now you have a page over here. Let's add one more functionality. We'll add an edit page. Again, this is done declaratively, and you choose which fields you want to have on that page. Right. So now you have a little application. You can turn it into live mode. You can click on someone, go and edit the details of that someone. Again, keep it in live mode, for example, update their age, and save the information, which would navigate back to the main page. Alright, so we saw the little basic behavior at runtime. Now let's actually try and explain or see what is happening in our page. So this is the visual view, and of course behind the visual view is the code view. The code is just Oracle Jet code, okay, basically HTML tags, okay. And if you look into the tags, you'll start to see things like variables. Okay, most importantly for our example, here is the table component. If we scroll to the left, there's a property for the table called data, and the data for this table comes from a variable which is at the page level, and the variable is called celebrities list service data provider. How can you reach those variables? This is this little button here. When you click on it, you'll see the variables in your page. Our page right now has two variables. One of them is the celebrities list service data provider. The type of this variable is a specific type to VBCS called the service data provider, which usually is hooked up to results of a REST service. Okay, so here you can see the endpoint it's hooked up to. You can see parameters that we're passing to it as well. Okay. We also have another parameters at the page, This one is the OJ table selected ID. This is just a string parameter. Where is this parameter being used? Again, let's go back into the designer, and we can see that there's a button here, and the button disabled is hooked up to this selected ID variable and checks whether this is empty. Okay. So now if we look back at the running behavior of our application, let's run it, and you'll notice that when we run the application, the button is disabled, meaning there is no value in that variable. However, when we click on a celebrity, the button becomes enabled because now there is a value in this variable. And you can actually see it when you go over to the table over here. Again, we'll exit the live mode, select the table, okay, and there's an event on the table, and this is the next thing you need to know beyond variable. It's the actions. Okay, so there's an action chain defined here. In fact, on this page, if we look at actions, there are two action chains. One of them is the selected chain. Okay, so the event that is being fired when we select a record on the table. The other one is an event called navigate to edit celebrities chain. Okay, so let's look at this event, for example, first. This is the chain. Okay, and you can see we're doing one simple thing in this chain. We're using this type of operation, which is the assign variable operation. And this operation, if you look at it, what it does, okay, is it takes and assign a value to this variable, to the page variable. It picks up the selected record that from the action that was fired and place it into this variable. So this is what happens when we click on a row in the table. Okay. Then what we saw is, again, go back to our page. Once we select something, the button becomes enabled. Let's look at what happens when we click the button. There's again an action chain. This is the second action chain, and this uses a different types of operation here. It uses the navigate operation, and if you look at the properties of it, you can see which page is it navigating to. This page has an input parameter, and we're taking the value from the selected ID and passing it to the next page. So those are the two action chains that are happening in our page, and as you can see, they work with the variables on the page, and they are being invoked from components on the page. Now, one of the nice things that we can do is we can actually modify the behavior of our application. For example, we can take the table with the selection event, and we can modify this to also do the navigation. Okay, so we can add either a navigation call directly down here, or we can even call the existing action chain. So let's bring this over, and from one action chain we'll call the other one. Right. So now if we go over and run our page, we can see the values, and the minute that we click on one of the rows, we'll navigate to the next page and we'll be able to do operations over here. On this page again, you'll have buttons, and the buttons would do other actions. For example, the save button will call a REST service and save the data. Let's look at that. We can again do the same functionality directly from here to get to this page. Let's look at the save button. Save button has an event, and the event is this action chain. On this page, by the way, you have again a variable called celebrity ID. This is indicated as an input parameter to this page, which is passed on the URL. The other variable here is an object, okay, that consists of those specific fields. Those were the fields that we chose when we created the page. Okay, so this is the celebrity record. And again, in this page we have actions. One of the action is the save celebrity. Now, as you can see, this action is a little bit more advanced than the previous ones that we've seen. Let's actually maximize the window here. And as you can see, it starts with this action, which is a call to the REST endpoint. If you click on it, you can see we're calling the update celebrity method on the celebrity object. We're passing in an input parameter, which is the celebrity ID, and we're also passing in the values to be updated. If you click on the mapper, you'll be able to see that the celebrity ID is mapped to the celebrity ID page level parameter. Okay, and the values that we update, the body, is mapped to the celebrity record parameter that we have from the page. So all of this has been created automatically for you just by using the wizard. But now at least you should have a basic understanding of the components of a page. Okay, so we talked about the components that make up the UI, the variables, and the actions. Okay. Now let's see if you can implement this knowledge when creating a new application without using any wizards. So let's create a new application. We'll call this one Crash2. And in this application, we're going to work with a web service instead of a business object. So let's create a service connection, and we're going to use this service over here. Okay. So we're going to define a service connection to this web service. Now, instead of having a fixed value here, I want to use a parameter. We'll call this one the code, and we'll put it in squarely brackets. Now this method returns information about a single country, so we'll call this one the country service. Okay, and we can set values for the default value for a parameter, US for example, and we can test our REST service to see those are the results for the US. Copy it to the response body, this is what you see here, and then create this connection. So now we have a connection to a REST service, and we're going to create a web application on top of it. Now, when you come to design an application, you might want to start by designing the user interface. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to have an input text component up here. This would be the code of the country. Now you might want to search based on the code, so next we're going to add a button, and the button is going to just say search. Then we might want to show information about the country. We can, for example, have the flag as an avatar and a couple of input components down here, like that. Okay. So this can be, for example, the name. This can be the population, and this one can be the capital. Alright, so we have the layout, we have the components. What we need next is a set of variables that would actually host the information for this page. So one variable we want to have is the country code. So we'll just define a country code string variable. Now the next variable we want to define is actually a collection of information that is based on what we get from the REST service. So what we can do is we can define a variable of type object and then define the various fields in it. But VBCS also gives us a shortcut, which is to define types. Okay, so let's create a type that is based on the endpoint for our REST service. Again, the nice thing here is that VBCS understands the structure of the service, and we can just choose all the fields. We can remove fields that are not interesting for us, for example, and just keep the things that are interesting, and create our own type. So we'll call this one the country type. Now that we have this type, we can create a new variable from this type. So now we have the two variables that are populating our components. So now let's connect the components to the variables. We'll take the data field and just map this one to the country code. This one would be mapped to our country variable, and inside this object to the flag object. This one would be the country name. This one will represent the population. And the last one is going to represent the country capital. Alright. So now we have UI components connected to variables. Now we need to define an action that would actually invoke the call to the REST service. This is the button action. Right? So we're going to the button and creating an event. This event is going to start by calling a REST endpoint. Okay, we're going to then select the endpoint, which would be the service we defined. Can give this one a name. And it requires a parameter. So let's hook this up to the page country code parameter. This is what we're passing into the call to the REST. The other thing we want to implement here is to tell VBCS that we're returning a country type when we call this REST. Next thing we want to do is take whatever is returned from this REST and assign it to the variables on the page. Right? So what is returned from our call to country REST is this structure, and we're going to put it into this structure, into this variable in our page, like this. Right, so now we're ready to go and run our page. When the page shows up, we can type in country code, click the button, and get information about that country. Like that. Right, so now let's play a little bit with what we just built. Okay. What happens, for example, if we don't want to actually press the button? We want to immediately, when we type something and the value changes, fetch the information. We can use another type of event that is available on a field. Okay. We actually have access to all the custom events, all the JavaScript events on this UI component. Okay. And there's lots of them. Okay. For example, if we want when someone clicks in this or when someone drags. Right? We're just going to use the default event, by the way, which is a value event, meaning when the value changes. This is a built-in event that VBCS provides to you. And what we want to do when we run this event is actually just call an action chain. So we'll bring in the action chain and connect it to the same event or same action chain that happens when we press the button. Okay. Now let's go back to the page and run the page. Or actually we can switch to just being in live mode and type in values, and we get the information. Just like that. And now we can actually remove the button. Like that. And our page would still function correctly. So we were able to create this page by understanding what's going on between components, variables, and actions. The next thing that you'll notice here is the settings for the page. And in the settings for the page, you would see things like the title and description, but also all the events at the page level. And one of the things you'll notice here is that you can also create events at the page level. For example, what's going to happen when I enter the page, okay? Or what happens when I navigate out of the page. So let me show you an example of such an event that you can create. We can create an action chain, and we'll call it the page load chain. And what we can do in the page load chain is we can automatically assign a variable, okay, and take for example the country code and assign to it the code for the US. Okay. And after we do this, we can call an action chain. Right? So we can call the chain that is the same thing that fetches the information. That's the button click chain. Now we can hook it up to our page. Okay, so in this page, we're going to go to the settings and create a new event on page enter. We're going to call the page load event. Now we can run the application. And we see that when the page loads, we by default get information about the US. Right, so now you learned about this section over here. Now let's look at the function. Function is a page module JavaScript function that you can add over here that will be available for your page. And what we're doing here is we're creating a page module level prototype say hi function. Okay? The function can also accept parameter. For example, let's create a parameter called message. And then we can have the function do something. For example, we can say hello plus the message. Okay? What we're doing here is we're putting it out to the console. Okay? Of course, this can do other stuff in your application. Now we want to invoke this logic from our application, so let's go back to the design and let's add a button. Okay, call it log a message, like that. And in the event for the button, we're going to create a new event when the button is clicked, and we're going to use our module function. So we're going to call a module function, and we're going to select the say hi function we just created, and it receives an input parameter, and we can take for example the name of the country we're currently watching and put it into the message. Right. So now we have action that is connected to our button. Let's run our little application. When it loads, we get the US. We can then switch to another country and then click the button. Now, before I click the button, I want to invoke our developer tools. Okay. As you can see in the console, you can already see there's a lot of information that Visual Builder Cloud Service puts here. I'm going to clean this information, and now I'm going to press the button. Okay, now let's go back and see what we got here. Okay, if we scroll a little bit up, we're going to see the Hello India message. But what you'll also notice is that we do provide you a lot more information about what's happening in your application. This is very helpful if you need to debug your application. We can see that we are handling the event for the button click. Okay, we're starting the action, and we can see which parameters we passed into this action. Right, so now you know a little bit about components, variables, actions, settings, JavaScript function, and the last part is code. This is all the code that represents your page. This is basically a lot of metadata that constructs your page, and VBCS uses this to run your application. It's important to know, by the way, that you have access to this also from here, from the source view. Okay, so in the source view right now, we have the country service, we have the country web application, In the web application we have a flow, and in the flow we have a page, and the page has an HTML file. This is this view. It has the JavaScript file with our method. It has the JSON file with our metadata. You can also directly access those files from here. It's also important to mention that those concepts of actions and variables are not just at the page level. In fact, if you go into your flows, okay, let's go back to the web application view, and we'll open the flow. You'll notice that we can also define variables and types at the flow level, as well as actions. Okay. And also events at the flow level. Furthermore, if you go to the application level, okay, you would find variables at the application level, as well as actions, and again settings here. Okay, so all of those are available for you also at the application level. Another thing that you'll find on the application level is the shell page. If you double click the shell page, you'll notice that this is basically the header and footer, or the template for all your application. So if you go, for example, and modify the title here, like that, each page in your application, if you go and look at the visual view of it, would now reflect the changes you made to the template. So now you have a template for your application. The last concept to explain here are flows. Flows are basically page navigations that you can define. Okay, if you need another page in your application, you click the plus, and for example, let's create the second page here, and we'll just drop some heading over the page and call it second page. Okay, so now we have two pages in our application. You can see them here, but if you look at the actual flow diagram, they are not connected right now. In order to connect them, you need to navigate from one to the other. So again, if we add another button here, and we call this one navigate, like that, and add an event on it, and in this event we'll use the navigate operation to navigate to a peer page in our flow, to the second page. Okay, now if you look at the flow, the two pages are connected. If you open the first page and you run it, you'll be able to navigate to the second page, and if you click back, you'll navigate back to the previous page. So those are flows. Inside an application, you can have multiple flows. So for example, we can add another flow, and in the second flow we're going to create again a start page. So we'll call this page start of second flow. Now if you want to navigate from one flow to the other, you do this from your master application, so from the shell, from the template. For example, we can add a navigation button here. Okay, and we'll call this one first flow, and add another one next to it, which would be a second flow. This is probably not the layout you want for your application, but it should be good enough for our example. Alright, so second flow, we're going to add a navigation here. Okay, so this would be a navigate, and the target is going to be or a flow in the current page or a root page. So actually we want a flow, so this would go to the second flow. Okay, and then let's go back to the previous page. Oops. This was this button. Now let's go over to this button again, define a click event on this one, and do a navigation
again to the main flow, first flow. Right, so now if we go over and run our application, we'll start with the main page and let's run it. So now our template has those two buttons here. Okay, if we click on this one, we'll go to the second flow, to the start of it. Click on this one, we'll go to the first flow. So this is navigation between flows, templates, which is another concept you would like to know about Visual Builder Cloud Service. So at this stage, you should be feeling quite comfortable with flows, with the root pages of your application, the shell page, and here you have a bunch of resources where you can add things like the style sheet for your application, images that you might want to use, etc. This should get you started with actually developing Visual Builder Cloud Service and have more of an understanding of how things behave beneath all the visual aspect. Good luck!